The silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library or the serene stillness of a meadow at dawn. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. I had stepped out of the chronopod, expecting parades. I expected a world celebrating 80 years of uninterrupted peace. A world where the great scars of the 20th century had never been carved into the flesh of humanity. I expected art, culture, and a renaissance of the human spirit. Instead, I stood in the middle of Times Square, but there were no flashing lights. There were no cacophonies of horns or tourists chattering in 100 languages. There were only gray monoliths rising into a leaden sky, and the rhythmic, terrifying sound of a million boots hitting the pavement in perfect, synchronized unity. I had fixed history's biggest mistake. I had erased the monster, but as I looked up at the banners draping down from the Steel Canyon's banners that bore a symbol far colder and more calculating than the one I had erased, realized, with a sick lurch in my stomach, that I hadn't saved the world. I had condemned it to something far worse. I had traded a chaotic fire for a permanent, frozen hell. My name is Julian, and I am or I was a historian. For years, I spent my nights in the archives, obsessing over the pivot points of time. We all know the question. If you could kill him as a baby, would you? It's the moral dilemma that haunts every first-year philosophy student. But I wasn't a killer. I was an academic. I didn't believe in violence. I believed in correction. My thesis was simple. The man who set the world on fire in the 1930s and 40s wasn't born a monster. He was made one by rejection, by terminus, by the crushing weight of failure in a cold Vienna autumn. I had access to technology that shouldn't exist. A prototype temporal displacement unit salvaged from a government black site that had been shut down in the late 90s. I wasn't going to kill the young artist. I was going to save him. And in doing so, I was going to save us all. The jump to 1907 was disorienting. The smell of the past is distinct. It smells of coal smoke, unwashed wool, and horse manure. Vienna was a city of majestic contradictions, imperial grandeur, masking a rotting underbelly of poverty. I found him exactly where the history books said he would be. A cheap, drafty cafe, near the Danube, nursing a cup of coffee he couldn't afford, staring blankly at a sketchbook filled with rigid, lifeless architectural drawings. He looked pathetic. He was shivering in a coat that was too thin for the Austrian winds, his eyes hollow with the anticipation of failure. He wasn't the dictator who would scream from podiums. He was just a sad, lonely young man, desperate for validation. I sat down across from him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment, the pivot point. I introduced myself as a patron of the avant-garde, a traveler from the Americas looking for raw talent. I opened my leather satchel bag filled not with weapons, but with high-quality pigments, brushes made of sable hair, and instructional manuals on perspective and color theory that wouldn't be written for another 20 years. I became his mentor. For 3 weeks, we worked in a small, rented attic. I taught him how to loosen his wrist, how to see the light not as a static object but as a living entity. I showed him the techniques of the future modernists, the emotional depth of expressionism, the vibrant chaos of the fauvists. I watched as the rigidity left his hand. The cold, architectural sterility of his work began to breathe. He painted the Vienna streets not as they were, but as they felt alive. Melancholy, beautiful, ad talente. He just needed someone to believe in him. The morning of the entrance exam for the Academy of Fine Arts was gray and drizzling. I walked him to the gates, carrying his portfolio. He was nervous, shaking like a leaf, but I gripped his shoulder. "You are an artist," I told him, looking into those eyes that history had learned to fear. "Today, you claim your destiny." I waited outside for 5 hours. When he emerged, he wasn't slumped in defeat. He was radiant. He ran to me, tears streaming down his face, waving the acceptance letter. The professors had been stunned. They called him a prodigy. He was in. He was going to be a painter. He would spend his life smelling of turpentine instead of gunpowder. Il had me, and in that embrace, I felt the timeline shift. The tension of the 20th century evaporated. I smiled, told him I had to return to my country, and walked around the corner to my extraction point. I left 1907 feeling lighter than air. That feeling lasted exactly until I materialized back in the present. The transition was smooth, but the arrival was wrong. The air tasted metallic. As I walked out of the displacement zone, the first thing I noticed was the architecture. The chaotic, beautiful mess of the modern city was gone. In its place were colossal structures of concrete and glass, brutalist and imposing, stretching up into the smog. There were no advertisements, no color, no music. The people on the streets wore identical gray tunics, their heads bowed, moving with the efficiency of ants in a colony. I grabbed a digital slate from a discarded pile. Technology was advanced, far beyond what I had left. But it was locked down, restricted. I hacked into the public history archives, my hands trembling so hard I could barely type. I needed to know what happened. The entry for the 1930s shattered my soul. The artist had indeed become a famous painter, living a quiet life in Vienna, dying in obscurity in the 1970s. But history, I learned, abhors a vacuum. The anger, the economic collapse, the national humiliation of Germany after the Great War, those things remained. Without the erratic, emotionally unstable leader I had removed, the void was filled by someone else, a general, a man whose name was barely a footnote in my original timeline, a Prussian aristocrat of terrifying intellect and absolute emotional detachment. He didn't scream, he planned. He didn't rely on racial fervor or occult mysticism. He relied on cold, industrial efficiency. Under this general, the war didn't start in 1939 with a chaotic invasion. It started in 1941. With a synchronized, overwhelming strike that decapitated the leadership of Europe in 48 hours. There was no Battle of Stalingrad, no wasted resources on ideological purges that hindered the war effort. This new regime didn't want to exterminate for hate. It wanted to assimilate for order. They conquered the Soviet Union not by brute force, but by turning its own starving population against the leadership with promises of bread and order. They developed the atomic bomb first not in 1945. But in 1943, London, Moscow, and Washington, D.C. didn't just surrender, they were erased. By 1950, the entire globe was under the banner of the World Directorate, a regime of absolute logic. No art, no dissent, no free will, just productivity. I stood there in the street of this alien future, watching a patrol of drones silently glide overhead, and realized the magnitude of my mistake. The dictator I had erased was evil, yes, but he was flawed. He was paranoid, strategical, incompetent at crucial moments, and driven by madness that eventually turned the world against him. He was a fire that burned itself out. But this was ice. This was a permanent, totalitarian winter. I had removed the human error from tyranny and paved the way for the perfect dictatorship. The world was at peace, yes. But humanity was dead. I had to go back. The realization broke me. I had to be the villain. I had to do the most cruel, heartless thing imaginable to save the future. I programmed the chronopod for the night before the exam, October 1907. I arrived at the attic studio while the young artist was asleep. The room smelled of hope and oil paint. His portfolio sat by the door, ready for the morning. I opened it. I looked at the beautiful landscapes, the vibrant portraits we had worked on together. They were good, they were objectively wonderful. And I took a knife to them. I slashed the canvases. I poured black ink over the watercolors. I snapped the sable brushes I had given him. I destroyed every shred of talent, every piece of beauty he had created. I replaced his portfolio with his old, stiff, lifeless, architectural sketchiest the ones I knew the Academy would reject. I sat in the corner of the room and waited for him to wake up, slipping out just before his eyes opened. I watched from the street as he ran out, screaming, clutching his ruined work. I watched him try to present what was left to the professors. I watched them laugh. I watched the light die in his eyes as he walked out of those gates, rejected, broken, the seed of hate planted firmly in his heart. I stood in the alleyway, the rain masking the tears streaming down my face. I was crying for him. I was crying for the millions who would die because of what I had just done. I was crying because I had just personally signed the death warrants of 60 million people to save the concept of freedom. I had to let the monster rise so that the world could learn, painfully and tragically, how to defeat him. I had to break one man to save the soul of the species. As the temporal field wrapped around me to take me home, I heard his shout of rage echo through the streets of Vienna. It was the sound of the 20th century beginning, and it was all my fault. Sometimes, the hardest choices in history aren't about doing what's right, but about preventing what's worse. It makes you wonder, is our timeline the good one? Or are we just the result of someone else's cleanup operation? If this story made you question the fabric of reality, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Smash the like if you enjoyed this journey through time, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a paradox. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you had the machine, and you knew the risks, would you still try to change the past? Let me know down below.